So what I'm going to talk about today is really a lot of new technology, some things that are happening, trends, both in the device industry as well as in the battery industry, and how those two are kind of linking up. And then I have one subject that I'm going to put in the category of a challenge, which is something that's really facing, I think, the portable medical industry that I don't have any answers, but I will pose some questions. But before I get started on some of that, I just wanted to give some context on how Greatbatch fits kind of into the grand scheme of medical batteries and some of the changes that have happened there. I think pretty much almost everybody knows that Greatbatch makes batteries for pacemakers and implantable defibrillators, because that's really how the company was started back in 1970. Since that time, obviously, like most companies, as they grow, we've diversified into other areas. So we started making tantalum capacitors for ICDs. We then branched into rechargeable batteries, our Q technology, which I'll talk a little bit about. Starting in the 2000s, though, we also started to move into what we call portable medical, which is batteries for non-implantable devices when we acquired EAC. And then more recently, a couple of years ago, when we acquired Micropower, we really expanded our presence in the so-called portable medical space. And then more recently, this year, the company's kind of restructured into more of a functional organization so that all the battery technologies kind of aligned under one technology organization. So we're not really separate organizationally anymore, which means that I now have responsibility for some of the cell technology aspects of the portable medical piece, which I'm relatively new to, but I will be speaking to today. So just kind of a quick highlight of kind of the presence of Greatbatch and medical batteries. And I'm not going to read through all these, but by and large, we make almost every kind of medical battery there is. So if there's any kind of implantable device, there's a good chance that we're either making a battery for that today, or we are working on one in a development sense. And we make portable medical batteries for just about every, this is just a partial list of all the different kinds of things that we do. So obviously we have a pretty big presence in this area. We're pretty familiar with what's going on. So this is what I'm going to be talking about. So I'm going to break this into kind of two parts. So I'm going to talk about implantable medical first, and then I'm going to talk about some portable medical issues. And then we're going to really start by talking about what are some of the trends in active implantable medical devices today. We're going to talk about ICDs, really still trying to drive smaller size, greater longevity, and more flexibility on the form factor. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the communication features that are common and what battery solutions there are for those on pacemakers, and MRI, which is an important issue today, and then finally rechargeable devices, which are becoming popular. And on the portable medical side, I'm going to talk about some new technologies, some things that we're doing with sterilizable batteries, and I'll explain what that's all about. And then finally, I'm going to raise a question. That's the challenge, is how do you determine battery value, which is, I think, a particularly challenge in the portable medical space. So to get started here, talking about technology. So I think Greatbatch actually developed QHR technology starting in the early 2000s and commercialized in the mid-2000s. And really this was designed for ICDs, and because ICDs require obviously, we want to have a high energy density because we want to have a small battery, but we also need a lot of power to charge the caps in an ICD. So we have to have a battery that can do both of those, and they kind of play against each other. So it's a bit of a challenge. So the concept that we came up with was to take silver vanadium oxide material and to put it on either side of the cathode so it's directly facing the anode. And what that does is it drives a really high power capability of silver vanadium oxide. But we stuffed the middle of it with CFX, which is a really high energy density material. So we're able to kind of try to have the benefit of the best of both worlds, so to speak. And so the great thing about this is that we really got a boost in energy density. We maintain the power of the old silver vanadium oxide batteries, but we also have no detectable self-discharge over the 10-year life of the battery. And very important is the impedance of the battery is consistent over time, which means that if you discharge it in 3 months or 3 years, you get basically the same power level and the same voltage curve. So that makes it predictable. So that was kind of the old news, and so obviously we're always trying to do something better, and this is some of the better stuff that we're working on, which is what we call, this is a really imaginative name, Gen 2 QHR. Which is really trying to take that QHR technology and take it up another notch And this is also trying to leverage also some more efficiency in the process, because our QHR technology is really quite complex to manufacture. So we're trying to take some of that disadvantage out of the technology. So just kind of showing where we were with SVO batteries in the early kind of around 2000 time frame. Two plateaus, if this is the time it takes to charge the capacitor on this y-axis over here. You're talking about, maybe here about 5 years longevity for this. This is just an example of a given form factor. So when we came out with QHR within the same package, we could extend the life by over a year, maybe a year and a half, and also maintain a more consistently low charge time. And what we're working on now is this Gen 2 QHR to try to extend this out another year and to continue to evolve that charge time consistent and lower. So the other major component that takes up a lot of space in an ICD are the capacitors. And historically, ICDs have had aluminum electrolytic capacitors. Greatbatch actually started making tantalum capacitors for ICDs in, I think it was early 2000s. And these tantalum capacitors offered some nice advantages over the aluminum in terms of the energy density, so they could be smaller. But the big drawback is that they operate at a lower voltage than the aluminum capacitors. So we have to put 3 to 4 of these capacitors into an ICD versus only 2 for the aluminum electrolytic. And the disadvantage of that is obviously 3 to 4 capacitors cost more than 2, and there's also a lot more complexity in connecting these things and balancing them. So that was a disadvantage of the tantalum technology. So really the holy grail would be to take this tantalum technology and raise the voltage so that we can use only 2, and that's something that we've been able to do now. And so we're starting to look towards trying to commercialize this technology, which is a 400 volt tantalum capacitor. And so we can now, like I said, we can put 2 and still get the same voltage as the aluminum 2 stack. And we can do it in a much smaller package because the energy density of the tantalum is quite a bit higher. So the change in volume is could be really quite substantial. And the other advantage of tantalum capacitors is that they have a very stable oxide layer. They maintain their efficiency throughout life. So if you look at this orange line, this is an accelerated test at 85 degrees C for 110 days. This is really meant to really represent the whole lifetime of one of these caps. And you can see the efficiency really doesn't change throughout life, whereas some of the other technologies, they do change, they do go down over time. This is a very stable, which means that the charge time is going to be stable throughout life. And then the other good thing about these is you don't need to reform the cap, so you don't need to waste any battery energy trying to reform this periodically. And so to kind of summarize that, you can make a smaller, thinner device with a stable charge time and only a 2 capacitor stack. So changing gears to pacemakers. So pacemakers used to be, didn't really communicate back in the days when we started making lithium iodine batteries for them. So lithium iodine was a really great chemistry because it provided really low power, but it was very reliable and it was very safe. But when people wanted to start to put telemetry features, communication features in the pacemakers, the lithium iodine batteries couldn't do it anymore. They just couldn't deliver the kind of current that was required. So kind of building off of the QHR technology, we made something we call QMR, which MR stands for medium rate, and HR stands for high rate. And really, this is the exact same cathode construct. The only difference between this and the HR is there's only 1 cathode instead of 6 or whatever in the HR cell. And this really, again, because the SVO is almost very, very little silver vanadium oxide, it really has the energy density of a CFX battery, but it has the power level as of an SVO battery with the same surface area. So this was a good solution for this application, and just kind of showing some data here to show the kind of power levels that this QMR can output. So it has really similar energy density as the products that came before it, or the technologies that came before it. But you can see here the power, if you look at the loaded voltage here, this is kind of, just to give you a sense, this is going to be kind of like tens of milliamps that this kind of battery can put out versus the very low microamp power that an iodine cell can generate. And even compared to CFX, you can see there's quite a bit of improvement, especially at beginning of life. We're able to drive the power that we need to do the telemetry. So I'm going to switch gears, talk about MRI a little bit here. So obviously there's pretty much almost everybody has an MRI conditional device now on the market, so almost all the major manufacturers. And so obviously if the device is going to go in the MRI, the battery has to go in an MRI. And I think we see a lot of questions about, well, what's going to happen if I put my battery in an MRI? So we have done quite a bit of work to try to answer that question, and I'm going to talk about an experiment that we did today. So really what this is all about, when you're going to put a battery in an MRI, you got to make sure that you're making it out of the right materials. You obviously don't want to put a big piece of steel in the MRI. And so what we did in this experiment is we actually built 500 milliamp hour rechargeable batteries. We put them in a 1.5T MRI, and we made them out of, I have 5 different combinations of materials here. And they're really all intended to be pretty much non-magnetic. So all of the case materials are what we would consider non-magnetic. So we had Ti 6.4, which is a grade 5 or grade 23, commercially pure titanium, and a 304L stainless. And then the anode tabs, we did have a little bit of magnetic material here in terms of a nickel, but only a very small quantity. And then we also had some that didn't have any magnetic content at all. And then we tested these to see what the mechanical properties would be, and then some of the image artifact, and also some of the temperature and voltage characteristics. So I'm going to start by talking about mechanical testing, the ASTM 2052. And so what we do is we kind of hang the cell, and we actually see how much it will actually move off center and measure this angle. And we found that the greatest forces were at the mouth of the bore, but interestingly enough, that regardless of what we did, all of these, from a mechanical force perspective, they were all fairly benign. So the most deflection we got, we did get more deflection when we had the nickel tab in there, but the most deflection we got was about 5 degrees. And the maximum force we measured was 0.014 newtons. And the weight of these in newtons of the cell is about 0.16 newtons. So the force is less than 10% of the overall weight. So I'd say all these forces are pretty benign. But we've had a lot of people who have asked, well, what's going to happen to the battery voltage if we put an MRI? So we actually measured that, and this is the result we got. You can see there's a little bit of noise when the MRI is on, but overall, all the battery voltages were very stable. Very little change. This is what we expected, but still the question has been raised many times. And we also monitored the temperature of the battery in the MRI, and you can see that there is actually a slight rise in the temperature. And this is caused by the eddy current heating from the RF energy. But it's pretty small. It's about 1 degree Celsius, and we actually measured it, in this case, 3 different places. And in all instances, we didn't really see much difference between the different material combinations in this test. They were all pretty similar. So again, this was all, I think, pretty benign. The one thing that certainly putting a battery in an MRI will do is it will give you an image artifact. There's no doubt about that. And so you can see we had a significant image artifact in all the different combinations of materials we tested. The size of the image artifact was a little bit different depending on the material. So if you put this highly resistive titanium 6.4 grade in, you did get a smaller artifact than if you use the commercially pure titanium. And the 304L was actually the worst. And the nickel lead really didn't make much difference at all. So rechargeable devices have become more prevalent. So 10 years ago, there were almost pretty much no rechargeable devices. Now, through inductive charging, they're starting to become more prevalent, particularly today in the neurostimulation space. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the technology going on there. So generally speaking, these are lithium-ion batteries. They are small, so they're typically on the 1 to 3 cc size, all the ones that are in the market today. They tend to be designed more for longevity versus energy density. So later I'm going to talk about portable medical. And I'm going to talk about batteries that are really designed for energy density versus longevity. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the issues associated with that. But here, the focus is more on longevity. We recognize that we need about 1,000 cycles in a 10-plus year life. And this is really an important point because when you look at a lot of these applications, and in fact, I'll talk about that a little bit more on the next slide, but this really becomes more of a calendar life than a cycle life game a lot of times. And then I'm going to talk about core guard capability, which I'll explain a little bit later what that means. But this is an example of some neurostimulator stimulation testing that we've been doing for 5 years. And so, when you look at this particular application, this is actually a 6-day discharge. So the discharge rate in neurostimulator is very, very low. And this actually for a neurostimulator would be considered a high rate. So this is like the highest that you might see. More typical might be a month or 2 months. So very few cycles over the course of 10 years. But in this particular case, we're kind of trying to stress the battery by going with a 6-day rate. And we actually tried to simulate different patient behaviors by kind of looking at, one case where somebody recharges whenever the battery's dead. And I don't know if anybody would do that, but another case where someone recharges every 4 days, no matter what. And another case where somebody recharges every day, no matter what. And we did one full discharge every month so we could see what the maximum runtime would be. And what's interesting is we found that it actually didn't matter very much what you did. We've so far, up to this point, we got the same retention up to 5 years. And what we do see, though, is that generally speaking, recharging every day is not really necessarily a good thing because the battery's at a higher state of charge, and we definitely do see more impedance build up as we go from A to B to C. But the rate is so low that that doesn't affect the runtime. And but at some point it may. It definitely will affect the rate at which you can charge the battery, though. But one of the points I just wanted to make, though, is that the calendar life really is the key here, especially when you're talking about a 1 or a 2 month discharge. You're really not talking about a whole lot of cycles during the lifetime, 10-year lifetime of the battery. Cochlear implant's a little bit of a different situation. So you're drawing a fair amount of power here. You don't have a lot of space in your head, but there certainly is a lot of interest in trying to generate a fully implantable system. I think most people have probably seen somebody with one of these today where they wear the battery behind their ear, but I mean it would be nice if you didn't have to wear that, and if it would be totally invisible you wouldn't know somebody had one of these. Because there really isn't a lot of space there in the head, you're typically talking about a pretty small battery, and this is an example of one. And as a result, we're kind of discharging the whole battery every day. So as a result, in 10 years, you need about over 3,000 or even 4,000 cycles. It's kind of tough for a lithium-ion battery. And on top of it, these devices have to be potted in silicone. So the silicone curing process is a pretty high temperature process, about 125 degrees Celsius. And there's also a drying cycle. So there's a lot of challenges here to making a battery for a cochlear implant. And we have done some work on optimizing the separator, the electrolyte, and we actually have been able to, and reducing the charge voltage to 4 volts, we have been able to meet the requirements of this application, showing you the comparison between kind of the normal treatment versus going through this whole silicone overmold and drying process, and they still work. So CoreGuard technology, what this really is I think anybody that works with lithium-ion batteries knows that you can't discharge them below 2.5 volts or else they can be damaged. For the most part, that's fine for most applications. There is some interest in some implantable applications. There's some concern where the device may not be used for an extended period of time. You might need to kind of bring it back, and obviously you don't want to have to do a surgical replacement at that point. So this is technology where the battery can be discharged all the way to 0 volts without causing corrosion of the negative current collector. And this just shows an example of what a kind of a standard battery does. The voltage will go down to a point, and then you'll start to see some additional voltage plateaus. These are copper corroding down here, and so with the CoreGuard technology, you can see it drops right to 0. We don't have any of that copper corrosion. And if you were to take those batteries and you were to leave them at 0 volts for an extended period of time, you can see the standard technology loses a lot of capacity. The CoreGuard technology is pretty much untouched. So now I'm going to shift gears. I'm going to put on my electrochem hat and talk about portable medical batteries. And I'm going to start by talking about some of the things that are happening in the lithium-ion battery industry that are going to be important in the portable medical industry. And one of the things that has been happening and continues to happen is the energy density continues to increase. So if you look at 18650s, when I started rechargeable batteries way back in, I guess it was 1999 or something like that, I think an 18650 was about a 1 or a 1.2 amp hour cell. And so today, 3 amp hours in 2012, 3 amp hours was kind of like the ultimate, the pinnacle. And actually this year we've gotten all the way up to 3.4 amp hours. So this continues to grow. And you can see over time is how we continue to bake in more of these higher amp hour cells, and the lower ones continue to shrink and kind of drop off. So now we're up to 3 and 3.4 amp hours. And how are people doing that? Well, we still really are kind of in the world of a graphite anode for now. I mean, we're probably getting pretty close to the point where that starts to change. Cathode technology, though, is still evolving. So we're seeing nickel, cobalt, aluminum oxide is becoming more common, replacing lithium cobalt oxide in some cases. Also, we're seeing a mixed nickel manganese cobalt and lithium cobalt oxide. So these are two that are becoming quite popular. And then there's also a surface coated lithium cobalt oxide. And this generates high energy density but changes the charge voltage to 4.35 volts, which is a pretty significant change for not only in terms of the cell technology but also for our pack designers. Safety. So as we start to cram more energy into a small spot, safety becomes more and more of a challenge. So the manufacturers are thinking about this and they're coming up with solutions. And so one of the solutions is to put a ceramic coating on the separator. And the reason that they do this is because the separator is made out of a plastic material, typically polyethylene or polypropylene. If you get a short, you're obviously going to generate a lot of heat. And if you generate a lot of heat, the plastic's going to melt and it's going to start to shrink. And so if it starts to shrink, the size of the short's going to get bigger, and that's not a good thing because that's going to generate more heat, and the potential is for something bad to happen. So what is becoming quite common, and I've just used an example here from Panasonic, almost all the manufacturers have some version of this. What they've done is they've put a layer of ceramic material on there, just kind of give it some mechanical stability, so that if there's a short and if there's heat, that this layer will not shrink, and therefore the short won't grow, and we won't see a kind of a perpetuation of the situation. Lithium-ion pouch cells. This is an interesting subject. So I think everyone's probably got an iPad, and iPads have a whole bunch of these kind of soft package cells in them. A lot of devices, a lot of consumer devices have them. And they're becoming more and more popular because they can be made very thin, and they're nice because a lot of the devices we have today, we want to make them thinner. So these are a good solution. So we definitely see interest in this kind of aluminum laminate package from a lot of our customers because of the weight and the thinness. And then finally this one, and this is the one I did want to talk a little bit about, is that so you don't have a deep drawn case here, you don't have a kind of a complicated header, so you do have the opportunity to customize this a little bit more easily. But there is one thing there is one kind of caution associated with this, and that is that there are a lot of battery manufacturers out there that are making these very, very inexpensively, very, very quickly, with very, very little validation. And so the one thing you do just have to be aware of is that while it can be tempting to get one of these, one of those at a very low price very quickly and customized to what you want, there are a lot of times quality sacrifices that are being made. So for example, some of these manufacturers don't do any kind of testing on these batteries when they make them. And really, a lot of this really pertains to medical device batteries, because in all honesty, I mean, if you're talking about an iPad, they're making tons and tons of these. I mean, there's a very robust process. But a lot of these medical devices don't have anywhere near that kind of volume. They may be 10, 20,000 devices a year. And that's just not a lot of batteries for these kind of manufacturers who are making these kind of cells. And so this kind of business doesn't appeal to a lot of the really big guys who are really good at it. One of the things we've seen in lithium-ion is that a lot more higher power lithium-ion cells. And what that's done is it's actually allowed new applications for batteries in medical devices. So surgical tools, historically there have been some nickel or lead acid based surgical tools, but these are generally speaking kind of heavy and kind of big. So what lithium-ion has really allowed is to downside, with higher power lithium-ion, is to be able to make these lighter and smaller so that they actually become more practical. So we actually see more and more interest in these kind of battery-powered surgical tools, and this is just a list of some of the, especially some of the orthopedic things that we're working on. But there is an issue. So these surgical tools have to be sterilized. So obviously they have to be sterile, and there's a number of different ways you can sterilize a piece of medical equipment. But the reality is, a number of these are really not practical with anything that has a battery that has circuitry in it. And a lot of the other ones just really aren't available in most medical settings. So autoclave is really the one that everybody wants to use to sterilize these tools. But the problem is that batteries don't really like autoclaves very much. So what that means is that the battery now needs to be able to survive high temperatures, so 130 degrees Celsius. They also, they obviously don't want to use these tools once and throw them away. So they may require up to 300 autoclave cycles. Well, 300 autoclave cycles at 130 degrees C is really difficult for a lithium-ion battery. And to make matters even worse is that these are high-power devices, so the battery's got to deliver high power. And when we take batteries to high temperature, they tend to develop impedance, and impedance is the enemy of high power. So it's really a big challenge to be able to meet these three requirements all at the same time. And I think this one obviously goes without saying, as the battery absolutely cannot, vent or catch on fire in the autoclave. And what we see is a lot of lithium iron phosphate-based solutions here, just because of the tolerance to high temperature and the high power capability. So before I move on to this, all I'm going to point out, so this is definitely an area that we're working on, is trying to develop these kind of batteries for these kind of sterilizable surgical tools. If anybody has any questions about this, I'd be happy to talk to you or to refer you to one of my colleagues to talk about where we stand with this and what we have available today. But I'm going to end with a question, and what's really a challenge, which is, and I've already alluded to it, which is how do you determine battery value? And I think, a lot of the battery industry, battery value is often measured in terms of price, lead time, and initial runtime. So everyone's kind of focused on what's the capacity of the battery, how much does it cost, when can I get it? Because these are things that are easy to verify, they're easy to see. What's harder to see is whether the battery you're getting, how long is it going to last? Is it safe? Is it reliable? And is it going to work the same next year as it does today? Those are really difficult to measure. They're just not something you can easily see. And I have some examples here of what I'm talking about. So for example, this is a picture of a battery pack with obviously very poor welding. You would not see this if you were just looking at the outside of the battery, but if it's not done correctly, this is what can happen. And if this happens, obviously the pack can be degraded or it can stop working completely. Even worse case is if you really don't take into account safety, because we are talking about a really high energy item here in a battery. We've crammed a lot of energy into a small space. There's always a risk of this can happen. And then this is something that I found. I think this brand name is kind of funny because at first I saw it, I thought it was really funny, but then I got to thinking about it and I thought it really was kind of illustrating the point, because not only did they name it UltraFire, but they also put a picture of fire here on the label, which is, I think, kind of hysterical. But what it really shows, though, is that when they're marketing this battery, this is a battery that's really marketed based on initial runtime and price. And from a marketing perspective, they haven't even thought about safety at all, because obviously they wouldn't have named this if they had thought about it, which probably tells you that their marketing people are, not stupid. It probably tells you that their customers aren't paying any attention to this stuff either, right? They know that their customers aren't paying attention to these things up here. So just to kind of build on this, I think a number of us were at the FDA battery workshop in July, and unfortunately Ken wasn't able to make it, but I'm sure he could lend some more color to this. But we saw a number of findings at this, and obviously there seems to be quite a few issues with portable medical batteries and some of the devices that fail most frequently. I think in the one in the AMI survey, they actually talked about what the purchasing factors were, and of course cost came up, technical specs, which I think means probably beginning of life runtime. But it's interesting, they did talk about battery life, so I mean that's good. So people clearly are thinking about that, although I suspect that most of this is more from the perspective of, we bought a bunch of these, they didn't work, we're not going to buy those again. But really interesting, 91% of them said that they buy their replacement batteries from a third-party distributor. And even for life-sustaining equipment, only 8% of them still bought OEM batteries. So obviously the reason they're doing that, OEM batteries are more expensive than the third-party batteries. So on the outside, that looks like a good purchase, and it could be a good purchase. On the other hand, it could be a bad purchase, and I'll give you an example of a bad purchase right here. But in general, we've actually looked at some of these, and we found a number of substandard pieces of construction. So it could be weld quality, shorting hazards, poor insulation, leakage, or cells that really we think are not very high quality. And I actually have an example over here. This is actually just one pack. Both of these are from the same pack. And if you look right here, you can see all the leads for this pack kind of coming up to the circuit board. There's no insulation on these leads whatsoever. So any one of these could very easily, touch each other. Hard to say exactly what that would. At the best case, that would probably mean that they wouldn't work correctly. Worst case, you could have a short. Something really bad could happen, especially because they've potted this thing in silicone and blocked the safety vents. So all of these cells have a pressure release safety vent. They're not going to work when you have it potted in silicone like this. So Just some, really an issue to kind of to keep in mind, which is that when it comes to batteries, there really is a little bit more complicated decision than just trying to find the cheapest one. And it really is hard to assess some of these other things. It really genuinely is. But it is something you need to think about when you're making a purchasing decision. So kind of just to wrap up here, so I've talked about, we're still continuing to evolve battery and capacitor technology to reduce ICD size, increase longevity, and enable physiological shapes. We're also, I think, trying to, try to reduce the cost of some of these components for, especially for caps, trying to reduce the number of capacitors. QMR batteries are a good solution for pacemakers with communication functions. Non-magnetic batteries, definitely safe to put them in an MRI. There will be image artifacts, which can be fine depending on if the battery is covering up anything that's important to you in the MRI. Rechargeable batteries are definitely here. I think we're going to continue to see more and more of those. And 10 plus year duration, very doable. And then in lithium-ion technology in general, we're seeing we can have superior runtime, size, weight, and safety through some of the technological advances that are going on today. Batteries, which can be autoclaved, are almost here and are going to be in surgical tools very soon. And then finally, assessment of battery value. Not a straightforward consideration because you also need to think about short battery life, unexpected failures, and safety risks in kind of your value equation. So that's really all I had, so I'd be happy to answer any questions at this point.